The park ranger's hands trembled as he pressed against the black bear cub's chest, muddy water streaming from its lifeless mouth onto the rocky shore. Ethan Mitchell had pulled drowning victims from Tellico Lake before, but never a bear, and never one that felt so familiar. The chip wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah Chen dropped her medical kit, syringes scattering across wet stones as she stared at the tiny GPS device glinting beneath the cub's matted fur. Her mentor, Dr. Cartwright, had specifically said no bears in this area carried tracking equipment, yet here it was, blinking steadily like a mechanical heartbeat. Eleanor Whitmore's weathered face went pale as she recognized the distinctive white patch above the cub's left ear. The same marking she'd seen 15 years ago on a different bear in a different time when everything she loved had been torn away. "Get it to the center now," Ethan commanded, though something cold twisted in his gut. Who had been watching this bear? And why did saving its life suddenly feel like stepping into a trap that had been waiting decades to spring? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Ethan Mitchell had believed his biggest problem was the loneliness that crept into his bones each evening when he returned to the cabin his father had left him. The same cabin where Robert Mitchell had taught him that every creature in Cherokee National Forest deserved protection, even the dangerous ones, especially the dangerous ones. At 32, Ethan carried his father's dedication to wildlife preservation like a sacred trust, but the weight of it had grown heavier since Robert's death 15 years ago. The official report called it a tragic accident, a seasoned park ranger caught off guard during a routine bear relocation. What the report didn't mention was that Robert had been trying to save 2 orphaned cubs when the mother bear attacked. Ethan still took his heart medication every morning, a reminder of the chest pains that had started the day they found his father's body. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now spent his days protecting the same species that had killed the man who raised him, but Robert's voice still echoed in his memory. "Every life has value, son, even when it costs us everything." Eleanor Whitmore had been watching Ethan from her cottage next door for longer than either of them realized. At 67, the retired elementary school teacher moved through her days with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to expect too much from life. She'd lost her son David in a military training accident 15 years ago, the same year Robert Mitchell died, and the grief had settled into her bones like arthritis, aching worst on quiet mornings when she forgot, for just a moment, that he was gone. Her pension barely covered the mortgage, but Eleanor had never missed a payment on the bags of bird seed and cat food she left out for the strays that wandered through her garden. She baked honey cakes every Tuesday, using a recipe she claimed came from her grandmother but never explained why she always made enough for a crowd when she lived alone. Neighbors often found extra loaves on their doorsteps, still warm and wrapped in checkered cloth. 20 minutes down the winding mountain road, Dr. Sarah Chen worked late into most evenings at the Cherokee Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, determined to prove herself worthy of the wildlife veterinary position she'd fought so hard to obtain. At 29, she carried the weight of student loans and the expectations of parents who had sacrificed everything for her education. Her specialty in bear behavior and GPS tracking technology made her invaluable to the research programs that kept the center funded, though she sometimes wondered if she cared more about the animals than the data they represented. The Rehabilitation Center sat nestled between towering pines and rocky outcroppings, its modern facilities a testament to federal funding and private donations. Sarah had helped design the specialized enclosures that allowed bears to recover while maintaining their wild instincts, never suspecting that the very technology she trusted would soon become the thread that unraveled everything she believed about wildlife protection. None of them knew their lives were about to collide around one small, drowning bear cub who carried secrets that reached back 15 years into their shared past. The distress calls echoed across Tellico Lake just after dawn, piercing through the morning mist like broken glass. Ethan had been conducting his routine patrol when the desperate bleating stopped him cold, his coffee mug freezing halfway to his lips. In 15 years of ranger work, he'd learned to distinguish between the sounds of the forest. This wasn't the casual splash of a deer drinking, or the territorial roar of competing males. This was the sound of something dying. He grabbed his binoculars and scanned the shoreline until he spotted the source. A black bear cub, maybe 18 months old, thrashing frantically in the deep water near the rocky outcropping. The animal must have fallen from the cliff above while foraging, and now the steep banks prevented any escape. Ethan watched in horror as the cub's movements grew weaker, its head disappearing beneath the surface for longer intervals. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to call for backup, to follow protocol, to wait for the wildlife team with proper equipment. But the cub's desperate eyes found his across the water, and suddenly Ethan was 17 again, reading his father's final report about the orphaned cubs Robert had died trying to save. "Every life has value, son." His father's voice cut through 15 years of careful distance. "Even when it costs us everything." Ethan kicked off his boots and dove into the murky lake water, the cold shocking his system into hyper-alert focus. The cub had gone under completely now, and Ethan swam with powerful strokes toward the spot where he'd last seen the small head. The water was deeper than expected, nearly over his head and thick with algae that stung his eyes. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from exertion but from the crushing familiarity of this moment. When his fingers finally brushed against wet fur, the cub was completely limp, its body heavy and unresisting in his arms. Ethan fought his way back to shore, dragging the lifeless weight through water that seemed to grab at them both with invisible hands. He hauled the bear onto the muddy bank and immediately began chest compressions, the way his father had taught him on practice dummies years ago. "Come on," he whispered, pressing rhythmically against the small rib cage. "Don't you dare give up on me." The sound of a car door slamming made him look up. Eleanor Whitmore was hurrying down the bank, her face pale with concern. She must have heard the commotion from her cottage and come to investigate. Without a word, she knelt beside him and began clearing water from the cub's mouth and nose with practiced efficiency. "Tilt his head back," she instructed, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "Keep the airway clear." Together they worked in desperate silence, Eleanor's weathered hands surprisingly gentle as she positioned the cub while Ethan continued compressions. The bear's fur was coarse beneath his palms, and he could feel the delicate bones of its rib cage flexing with each push. 15 minutes passed. 20. Ethan's arms burned with fatigue, but he refused to stop. Then, impossibly, he felt it, a faint flutter beneath his hands. The cub's eyes opened slightly, unfocused but alive. Water trickled from its mouth as it took a shuddering breath. "Thank God," Eleanor whispered, and there was something in her voice that made Ethan look at her more closely. She was staring at the cub with an expression he couldn't quite read, relief mixed with something deeper, more complex. It was Eleanor who first noticed the chip. As she gently examined the cub for injuries, her fingers found the small, hard lump beneath the wet fur just behind its left ear. She carefully parted the black hair, revealing a tiny electronic device no bigger than a pill, blinking steadily with a soft blue light. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice strange, "you need to see this." The Cherokee Wildlife Rehabilitation Center hummed with quiet efficiency as Sarah Chen prepared the emergency treatment room. Bailey, as Eleanor had quietly named the cub during the 30-minute drive, lay sedated on the examination table, his breathing steady but still labored from the near drowning. The GPS chip sat in a small metal dish nearby, no longer blinking but somehow more ominous in its silence. I've never seen tracking technology this sophisticated on a wild bear, Sarah murmured, adjusting the overhead lamp to get a better look at the device. This isn't standard wildlife management equipment. The casing is military grade, and look at this serial number. It's at least 15 years old. Ethan paced the small room, unable to shake the feeling that saving Bailey had set something dangerous in motion. Who would chip a cub? And why keep it secret from the Park Service? Eleanor sat quietly in the corner chair, her eyes never leaving Bailey's sleeping form. She'd been unusually silent during the drive, offering only occasional directions and soft reassurances when the cub had whimpered in the back seat. Now she watched Sarah work with an intensity that made Ethan wonder what she wasn't telling them. "I need to run some tests on this chip," Sarah said, carefully placing it in a specialized reader connected to her computer. "The frequency is unlike anything in our current tracking database. It's almost like it's designed to broadcast to a completely different network." As Sarah worked, Bailey began to stir. His dark eyes opened slowly, scanning the unfamiliar room before settling on Ethan. Instead of the fear or aggression typical of wild bears in captivity, Bailey made a soft chuffing sound and tried to lift his head toward the ranger. "That's unusual," Sarah observed. "Bears his age should be terrified of humans, especially after trauma." "But look at his body language. He's not showing any stress indicators." Ethan approached the table cautiously and extended his hand. Bailey sniffed it briefly, then did something that made Sarah gasp. The cub gently touched Ethan's palm with his nose, then looked directly into his eyes, a behavior that wild bears simply didn't exhibit. "It's like he knows you," Eleanor said softly from her chair. "Like he remembers something." Before Ethan could respond, Sarah's computer chimed with the chip analysis results. Her face went pale as she read the data scrolling across the screen. "This can't be right," she whispered. "According to this, the chip was registered to something called Project Guardian, and the primary contact is—" She looked up at Ethan with confusion. "Robert Mitchell. Wasn't that your father's name?" The room fell silent except for Bailey's gentle breathing. Ethan felt the familiar chest tightness that came with mentions of his father, but this was different, sharper, more urgent. "That's impossible," he said. "My father never worked with tracking technology. He was old school, believed in observation and minimal intervention." Sarah pulled up more data, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "The chip's movement history shows Bailey has been tracked continuously since birth. Look at these coordinates. He's never strayed more than a 5-mile radius from your cabin, Ethan. For 18 months, this bear has been living practically in your backyard." Eleanor stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air," she said, her voice strained. "This is all very overwhelming." She headed for the door, but Bailey's reaction stopped her cold. The moment Eleanor moved, the cub became agitated, making urgent vocalizations and struggling against his restraints. When she turned back, he immediately calmed, watching her with what could only be described as recognition. "Eleanor," Ethan said slowly, "have you seen this bear before?" She stood frozen in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles were white. I think I need to tell you both something. About 15 years ago. About your father, Ethan. And about why this bear knows me." Sarah saved the chip data to her secure drive and looked between them. Whatever happened 15 years ago, someone went to great lengths to keep track of this specific bear. And now that we've found him, I have a feeling they're going to come looking. As if summoned by her words, the phone in the treatment room began to ring. Sarah glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "Dr. James Cartwright, Wildlife Research Division." "I've never heard of him, but he's asking specifically about an unusual bear rescue reported this morning." Ethan and Eleanor exchanged a look loaded with unspoken history. "Don't answer it," Eleanor said quietly. "Not yet. Not until I tell you what really happened the day Robert Mitchell died. Eleanor's confession came in fragments over the next 3 days, each revelation more shocking than the last. She told them about finding 2 orphaned bear cubs 15 years ago after hunters had killed their mother. How Robert Mitchell, then a young park ranger with unconventional ideas about wildlife rehabilitation, had convinced her to help raise them in secret, rather than surrender them to authorities who would likely euthanize cubs so young. "Your father believed those babies deserved a chance," Eleanor said, sitting in Sarah's office as Bailey recovered in the adjoining room. "We fed them with bottles, taught them to forage, kept them safe until they were old enough to survive on their own. One of them had a distinctive white patch above his left ear, just like Bailey." Ethan struggled to reconcile this image of his father with the man he remembered, dedicated but always by the book, never one to bend regulations. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" "Because what we were doing was illegal," Eleanor replied. "Raising wild bears without permits, keeping them on private property. If we'd been caught, Robert would have lost his job, and I would have faced criminal charges. But we couldn't just let them die." Sarah had been quietly analyzing Bailey's GPS data while they talked. "Eleanor, if Bailey is descended from one of those cubs, it would explain his unusual behavior around humans. Bears can inherit learned behaviors through observation. If his mother or grandmother had positive human contact—" "There's more," Eleanor interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The day Robert died, he wasn't responding to a routine bear call. He'd gotten word that someone was looking for our cubs, now grown bears with their own families, someone who knew about the GPS chips we'd had implanted to track their well-being." The room fell silent. Outside, Bailey could be heard making soft, contented sounds as he played with the enrichment toys Sarah had provided. His recovery had been remarkable, not just physically, but emotionally. He showed none of the trauma typical of rescued wildlife, instead displaying an almost dog-like attachment to Ethan and Eleanor. "Chips?" Ethan's voice was sharp. "You're saying my father participated in tracking wild animals?" Eleanor nodded reluctantly. "It was Robert's idea. He'd read research about using GPS technology to monitor rehabilitated animals, ensure they were adapting properly to the wild. We thought we were being responsible. We never imagined someone might use that information for other purposes." Dr. James Cartwright arrived at the rehabilitation center on Thursday morning, unannounced, and accompanied by 2 men in dark suits who identified themselves as federal wildlife agents. He was a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of authority. His credentials were impeccable. Ph.D. in wildlife biology from Cornell, 15 years with the Fish and Wildlife Service, published research on bear behavior and conservation. "I understand you've rescued a rather unique specimen," Cartwright said, his tone friendly but professional. "My department has been tracking this particular animal's lineage for some time. We'd like to transport him to our research facility for comprehensive study." Sarah felt immediately defensive. "Bailey is still recovering from near drowning. Moving him now could cause significant stress." "Bailey?" Cartwright raised an eyebrow. "You've named him? That's unusual protocol for a wild bear destined for release." Ethan stepped forward. "What kind of research are you planning? And why the federal interest in one bear cub?" Cartwright's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "This animal represents a unique genetic line with remarkable adaptation characteristics. Our preliminary data suggests he may carry traits that could be valuable for conservation breeding programs. We need to conduct thorough behavioral and genetic analysis." What Cartwright didn't mention were the late-night phone calls he'd been making to contacts in overseas markets where exotic animals commanded premium prices, or the medical bills stacking up on his desk for his granddaughter Lily's experimental cancer treatments, or the fact that a healthy young black bear with unusual human socialization could fetch upwards of $200,000 from the right buyers. Eleanor watched Cartwright through the observation window, her instincts screaming warnings she couldn't yet articulate. Something about his manner, the way his eyes lingered on Bailey with an assessment that felt more commercial than scientific, reminded her of the men who had come asking questions 15 years ago, the men Robert had died trying to avoid. "How did you know about Bailey's rescue?" she asked. "We haven't filed any official reports yet." "Word travels quickly in our community, Mrs. Whitmore. Unusual rescues are always of interest to researchers." Cartwright's tone remained pleasant, but Eleanor caught the slight emphasis on her name. He knew who she was. Sarah had been discreetly running background checks on her computer while they talked. "Dr. Cartwright, I'm having trouble finding any current research projects that would justify removing a healthy bear from rehabilitation. Could you provide more specific information about your study parameters?" Cartwright's facade slipped for just a moment, revealing something colder underneath. "I'm afraid much of our work is classified. National security implications related to wildlife trafficking prevention. I'm sure you understand the need for discretion." In the adjoining room, Bailey had become increasingly agitated. The normally calm cub was pacing his enclosure, making distressed vocalizations that grew louder whenever Cartwright spoke. Sarah had never seen him display such behavior. It was almost as if he sensed danger. "The animal seems distressed by strangers," Ethan observed. "Perhaps it would be better to wait until he's fully acclimated before considering any transfers." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Cartwright replied. "My transport team is already en route. We'll be taking custody this afternoon." Eleanor felt panic rising in her chest. The same helpless fear she'd experienced 15 years ago when official-looking men had come asking about the cubs, about Robert's research, about things that were supposed to remain secret. She'd watched Robert drive away that morning to meet with them, promising he'd be back by evening to help her prepare dinner for the cubs' release celebration. He never came back. "What if we refuse?" Sarah asked boldly. "This facility operates under state jurisdiction. I'm not sure federal agents have authority to simply remove animals without proper documentation." Cartwright's two companions stepped forward slightly, their posture subtly threatening. "Dr. Chen, I'm sure you're aware that federal law supersedes state regulations when it comes to endangered species protection. Interfering with a federal investigation could have serious consequences for your career." The threat was clear, but Sarah held her ground. "Then I'll need to see a federal warrant, and I'll need to contact my supervising veterinarian to discuss proper transfer protocols." "That won't be necessary," Cartwright said smoothly. "We have all required documentation. My associates will begin preparing the animal for transport while we complete the paperwork." But as the federal agents moved toward Bailey's enclosure, Eleanor made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped directly into their path, her slight frame blocking the door to Bailey's room. "No," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "You're not taking him." Cartwright's mask finally dropped completely. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're in no position to interfere with federal operations. Your history of illegal wildlife rehabilitation is well documented. I'd hate to see you face prosecution at your age." The words hit like a physical blow. He knew. He knew about the cubs, about Robert, about everything they'd tried so hard to keep secret. Eleanor realized with growing horror that Bailey's rescue hadn't been random. It had been orchestrated. Someone had been waiting for this moment for 15 years. "Ethan," she whispered, "get Bailey out of here." "And now." But before anyone could move, Bailey himself made the decision for them. The intelligent cub had somehow managed to open his enclosure door, a feat that should have been impossible given the sophisticated locking mechanism. He padded directly to Eleanor, placing himself between her and the federal agents with a protective stance that was both heartbreaking and defiant. "Remarkable," Cartwright murmured, his scientific interest momentarily overriding his other motivations. "The level of human bonding is extraordinary. He'll fetch an exceptional price." The words slipped out before he could stop them, revealing the truth that Eleanor had suspected all along. This wasn't about research or conservation. This was about money. And Bailey was nothing more than valuable merchandise. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard as she activated the facility's emergency lockdown protocol. Steel shutters descended over the windows, and electronic locks engaged on all exterior doors. "Security breach," she announced into her radio. "All staff implement containment procedures immediately." "You're making a serious mistake," Cartwright warned, but his confidence was finally beginning to crack. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Eleanor looked down at Bailey, who was pressed against her legs, then up at Ethan, who stood frozen between his duty as a ranger and his growing certainty that everything he'd believed about his father's death was wrong. "Neither do you," she said quietly. "But I'm about to tell them." The truth erupted from Eleanor like a dam bursting after decades of pressure. With the facility in lockdown and Cartwright's true nature exposed, she finally told them everything. How Robert Mitchell hadn't been her colleague in wildlife rehabilitation, but her younger brother. How the man Ethan had called father was actually his uncle, who had raised him after Eleanor was forced to give up custody. "I was 17 when you were born," Eleanor said, her voice breaking as she looked at Ethan. "Unmarried, no family support except Robert. The adoption agency said you needed stability, a proper family. Robert and his wife Sarah couldn't have children, so they took you in. I was supposed to disappear from your life completely." Ethan felt the world shifting beneath his feet. "You're my mother?" "I stayed nearby to watch you grow up. Every school play, every little league game. I was there in the back pretending to be just another neighbor." "Robert knew. But we agreed it was better for you to have a normal childhood without the confusion." Bailey seemed to sense the emotional turmoil, moving closer to both Eleanor and Ethan with protective instincts that defied his young age. Sarah watched the interaction with growing amazement. The bear was displaying behavior patterns more sophisticated than anything in the scientific literature. Cartwright, meanwhile, had been making quiet phone calls to his contacts, growing increasingly agitated as his carefully laid plans began to unravel. The federal agents with him weren't actually federal agents at all, but private security hired through shell companies. His entire operation had been built on intimidation and forged credentials, banking on the assumption that small-town wildlife workers wouldn't question federal authority. "Dr. Chen," Cartwright said, his voice taking on a more desperate edge, "you don't understand the larger picture here. This animal represents years of research investment. We've tracked his genetic line, monitored his development. He's not just any bear, he's the product of a specialized breeding program." "What kind of breeding program?" Sarah demanded, her fingers still poised over her emergency alert system. "The kind that produces animals with unique physiological characteristics," Cartwright replied, abandoning any pretense of legitimate research. "Bailey's lineage has been selectively maintained for specific traits. His heart, in particular, shows remarkable similarity to human cardiac structure. There are buyers in overseas markets who pay exceptional sums for such specimens." The words hung in the air like poison. Eleanor gasped, finally understanding the true scope of what they were dealing with. "You're talking about organ harvesting. You want to kill him." "I want to save my granddaughter," Cartwright snapped, his calm facade completely shattered. "Lily is 8 years old. She needs a heart valve transplant that costs more money than I'll ever have. Insurance won't cover experimental procedures. This bear could save her life." The moral complexity of the situation hit everyone simultaneously. Here was a man willing to commit horrific crimes not out of greed, but out of desperate love for a dying child. Ethan found himself struggling with unwanted sympathy, even as he instinctively moved to protect Bailey. "There has to be another way," Sarah said. "Legitimate medical research, fundraising, insurance appeals." "I've tried everything," Cartwright interrupted. "Do you know what it's like to watch a child suffer while bureaucrats shuffle paperwork? To know you have the power to save her, but society says it's wrong?" Eleanor stepped forward, Bailey still pressed against her side. "I know what it's like to lose everything for love. But Robert died trying to protect animals like Bailey from people like you. I won't let his sacrifice be meaningless." The mention of Robert seemed to trigger something in Cartwright's memory. Robert Mitchell was interfering with a vital research program. He threatened to expose operations that could have saved dozens of children. His death was unfortunate, but necessary. The admission hit Ethan like a physical blow. "You killed my father?" "I didn't personally pull the trigger," Cartwright said, all pretense of justification crumbling. "But yes, I ordered the elimination of the threat he posed to our network." Robert had become too curious about where the GPS data was being sent, too interested in protecting animals that were more valuable as medical resources. Bailey reacted to the rising tension in the room by positioning himself more deliberately between Eleanor and the threats he sensed. His intelligence was startling. He seemed to understand not just the emotional context, but the actual danger posed by Cartwright and his associates. Sarah had been quietly documenting everything on her phone's recording app. "You just confessed to murder in front of witnesses. This conversation is being recorded and automatically uploaded to secure servers." Cartwright's face went pale. "You have no idea what you've just done. This network extends far beyond one small research facility. There are people with significant resources who won't tolerate this kind of interference." "Then we'd better make sure Bailey disappears before they can find him," Eleanor said with sudden determination. "I lost my brother to these monsters. I won't lose my son or this bear." Ethan was still reeling from the revelation that Eleanor was his mother, but her words sparked something protective and fierce in his chest. "What are you suggesting?" "We take Bailey and run. Get him somewhere safe while Sarah contacts real federal authorities." "There are still good people in law enforcement who care more about justice than money," Cartwright laughed bitterly. "Where could you possibly hide? We've been tracking this animal's family line for 15 years. We have resources you can't imagine." "But you don't have local knowledge," Eleanor replied. "Robert and I explored every cave, every hidden valley in these mountains when we were raising the original cubs. There are places that don't show up on any GPS system." Sarah looked between them, her mind racing through the implications. "If I help you, I'll lose my job, probably face criminal charges for interfering with a federal investigation." "It's not a real federal investigation," Ethan pointed out. "These are criminals using fake credentials." "Try proving that in court," Cartwright sneered. "My documentation is perfect." "By the time anyone sorts out the truth, the bear will be long gone and Lily will have her operation." Bailey suddenly became agitated, making urgent vocalizations and moving toward the facility's rear exit. His behavior was so purposeful that Eleanor found herself following him, trusting instincts that reached back 15 years to when she'd learned to read the signals of frightened cubs. "He's trying to tell us something," she said. "The original cubs used to do this when they sensed danger approaching. Bailey must have inherited the behavior." Sarah checked her security monitors and felt her blood run cold. "There are vehicles approaching from 3 different directions. At least a dozen men, heavily armed." Cartwright smiled with grim satisfaction. "I told you this network has resources. They don't like to leave loose ends." The sound of engines grew louder, and through the steel shutters they could see lights moving through the forest. Eleanor made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She grabbed the emergency release for the rear exit, overriding Sarah's lockdown. "Ethan, get Bailey to the old cabin foundation up Hickory Ridge. You'll find supply caches Robert and I left there years ago. Sarah, destroy any data that could help them track us." "Eleanor, no," Ethan protested. "We stay together." "Someone needs to slow them down," she replied, her teacher's voice carrying absolute authority. "I've been running from this fight for 15 years. Robert died protecting what we believed in. It's time I did my part." Bailey seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He moved directly to Ethan, bumping against his legs with urgent insistence while keeping his intelligent eyes fixed on the approaching threat. "Go," Eleanor said, embracing her son for the first time in 32 years. "Protect him the way Robert protected you." As Ethan reluctantly led Bailey toward the rear exit, the first explosion rocked the front of the building. Cartwright's reinforcements weren't planning to take any chances. They were coming in with overwhelming force, prepared to eliminate any witnesses to their operation. Sarah grabbed her laptop and emergency medical kit while Eleanor positioned herself near the main entrance, preparing to buy them precious time. "Tell me you have a real plan," Sarah whispered to Eleanor. Eleanor smiled grimly, pulling out her phone to dial a number she'd memorized 15 years ago but never had the courage to use. "Robert left me more than just supply caches. He left me contacts, people who've been waiting a very long time for someone to blow the whistle on this whole operation." The nightmare was far from over, but for the first time since Bailey's rescue, Eleanor felt like they might actually have a fighting chance. The explosions had stopped, but the silence that followed was far worse. Ethan crouched behind a fallen oak tree halfway up Hickory Ridge. Bailey pressed close against his side, both of them listening to the distant sounds of systematic destruction coming from the rehabilitation center below. Smoke rose through the forest canopy, and the acrid smell of burning electronics drifted on the mountain wind. Sarah's panicked voice crackled through Ethan's radio one final time. "They've got Eleanor. Cartwright's people took her alive, but they're demanding Bailey in exchange. You have 2 hours to bring him to the old quarry or they'll—" The transmission cut to static. Ethan's hands shook as he tried to raise Sarah again, but the radio remained silent. Bailey sensed his distress and made soft, worried sounds, his dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth of understanding. The bear was barely more than a cub, but he carried himself with the gravity of someone who knew lives depended on his choices. The supply cache Eleanor had mentioned was exactly where she'd said it would be, hidden beneath a pile of stones that looked natural but had been carefully arranged. Inside the waterproof container, Ethan found camping supplies, emergency food, and a handwritten letter in his father's careful script. The paper was yellowed with age, dated 15 years ago, and addressed simply to whoever finds this first. Robert's words revealed the true scope of the nightmare they'd stumbled into. The wildlife trafficking network stretched across 3 continents, with connections to legitimate research institutions, government agencies, and private medical facilities. Bears like Bailey weren't just valuable for their organs, they were being bred for specific genetic traits that made them ideal subjects for experimental procedures that would never be approved using human subjects. "If you're reading this," Robert had written, "then something has happened to Eleanor and me, and the network has finally made their move. The GPS chips aren't just for tracking, they're for genetic verification. Each animal carries documentation of their bloodline, their medical history, their value on the black market. Bailey's mother was worth $300,000. Bailey himself, with his unique heart structure and human socialization, could command twice that." The letter included a list of contacts, journalists, federal agents, and wildlife advocates who had been quietly building a case against the network for years. But it also contained a warning that chilled Ethan to the bone. "They have people everywhere." Trust no one in official positions until you can verify their credentials through the emergency contact list. Bailey nudged Ethan's hand with his nose, then looked meaningfully toward the quarry where Eleanor was being held. The bear's behavior was becoming increasingly sophisticated, as if stress was accelerating his cognitive development. He seemed to understand not just that Eleanor was in danger, but that he was the key to saving her. Ethan's heart medication felt heavy in his pocket as he considered their impossible situation. Trading himself and Bailey for Eleanor would likely result in all three of their deaths. Cartwright couldn't afford to leave witnesses, but attempting a rescue with just himself and a bear cub against armed professionals seemed equally suicidal. The decision was made for him when Bailey suddenly bolted toward the quarry, his powerful legs carrying him down the mountainside with surprising speed. Ethan cursed and gave chase, but the bear had a significant head start and seemed to know exactly where he was going. By the time Ethan reached the quarry's edge, he could see the scene unfolding below. Eleanor was tied to a chair in the center of the old mining operation, surrounded by at least 8 armed men. Cartwright stood nearby, checking his watch with growing impatience. 3 black SUVs were parked at the quarry's entrance, engines running. Bailey had positioned himself on a rocky outcropping directly above the scene, and Ethan watched in amazement as the bear began to systematically push loose stones over the edge. The rocks crashed down into the quarry with tremendous noise, causing the armed men to scatter and dive for cover. In the chaos, Eleanor managed to tip her chair over and begin working at her restraints. But Cartwright quickly regained control of the situation. He pulled out a high-powered rifle and aimed it directly at Bailey's position. "Come down now, or I shoot the bear and your mother both." Ethan felt his chest tighten with the familiar pressure that came with extreme stress, but this time he welcomed it. The pain reminded him that he was Robert Mitchell's son in every way that mattered, that some fights were worth dying for. He stood up slowly, making himself visible to the men below. "I'm here. Let Eleanor go, and you can have Bailey and me both." Cartwright smiled coldly. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. You see, we need Bailey alive for the medical procedures, but witnesses..." He shrugged. "Witnesses are a liability we can't afford." As the armed men began to close in, Ethan realized with growing horror that Eleanor's desperate gamble had failed. They were all going to die in this forgotten quarry, and Bailey would spend his final days as a medical specimen in some underground laboratory. The nightmare had become complete. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the mountain air just as Cartwright's men closed in on Ethan's position. But instead of the reinforcements Cartwright had been expecting, federal agents rappelled down into the quarry with military precision. Real federal agents this time, wearing official FBI tactical gear and moving with the coordinated efficiency of a long-planned operation. "FBI, everyone on the ground now!" The lead agent's voice boomed through a megaphone as snipers took positions on the quarry rim. Cartwright's men found themselves outgunned and surrounded within seconds, their weapons clattering to the ground as they raised their hands in surrender. Eleanor had managed to free herself from her restraints during the chaos and was now crawling toward cover behind an old mining cart. Her face was bruised and her clothes torn, but her eyes blazed with fierce satisfaction as she watched Cartwright's operation crumble around him. "How?" Cartwright demanded, his rifle still trained on Bailey's position even as red laser dots appeared on his chest. "How did they find us?" The lead FBI agent, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and hard eyes, stepped forward. "We've been tracking your network for 3 years, Dr. Cartwright. Or should I say, James Morrison. Your real name was the first thing we discovered when we started investigating the death of Robert Mitchell." Ethan felt the world shift again. "Morrison? Your Dr. Cartwright doesn't exist," Agent Patricia Russo explained, keeping her weapon trained on the imposter. James Morrison was a veterinary technician who was fired from 3 different research facilities for ethical violations. He's been using stolen credentials and forged documents to operate this trafficking network. Eleanor pulled herself upright, her voice carrying across the quarry with surprising strength. The emergency contact number Robert left me, it went directly to Agent Russo's task force. They've been waiting 15 years for enough evidence to take down the entire network. Morrison's facade finally cracked completely. You have no idea what you've destroyed. My granddaughter. There is no granddaughter, Agent Russo interrupted. We checked. James Morrison has no living family. The girl in the photos you've been showing people is a stock image from a medical website. The revelation hit even Ethan like a physical blow. Every justification Morrison had offered, every appeal to paternal love and desperate circumstances had been a lie designed to manipulate their emotions. Bailey had been nothing more than merchandise to him, worth killing for only because of the profit he represented. Bailey himself seemed to understand that the immediate danger had passed. The intelligent cub climbed down from his rocky perch and padded directly to Eleanor, who gathered him into her arms with tears streaming down her face. The reunion was profound in its simplicity. A woman who had lost everything, finding solace in protecting the innocent life her brother had died defending. Sarah emerged from behind one of the FBI vehicles, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and a satisfied expression on her face. The data recovery worked perfectly, she announced. Every transaction, every contact, every animal that passed through their network. It's all documented. Morrison was meticulous about keeping records. Agent Russo nodded approvingly. Dr. Chen's cooperation has been invaluable. She managed to preserve digital evidence that connects this operation to wildlife trafficking networks in 12 countries. We'll be making arrests for months. Morrison made one last desperate play, lunging toward his rifle as Bailey passed nearby. But Ethan was faster, tackling the older man to the ground with a force that surprised them both. 15 years of grief and unanswered questions gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. "That's for my father," Ethan said quietly, as FBI agents moved in to make the arrest. As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, he turned back one final time. "You think you've won something? This network is bigger than you imagine. There are others who will continue the work." "Not anymore," Agent Russo replied. "Thanks to the evidence you've all provided, we're coordinating simultaneous raids on facilities in 7 states and 4 countries. This particular nightmare is over." The next hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, witness statements, and evidence collection. Bailey was thoroughly examined by a team of legitimate wildlife veterinarians who confirmed that he was healthy and showed no signs of the genetic modifications Morrison had claimed. The GPS chip was carefully removed and sent to FBI laboratories for analysis of its data trails. Eleanor's injuries were minor, mostly bruises and exhaustion from her ordeal, but the emotional healing would take much longer. She sat with Bailey in the back of an ambulance, both of them wrapped in emergency blankets, while Ethan gave his statement to federal investigators. "The hardest part," Eleanor told Agent Russo, "was living with the fear that speaking up would put Ethan in danger. Morrison's people made it clear that any interference would have consequences. I thought if I stayed quiet, stayed invisible, I could protect the only family I had left." "Your brother Robert was more prepared than you knew," Agent Russo replied, showing Eleanor a thick file labeled Project Guardian, Confidential. He'd been working undercover with our task force for 2 years before his death. "Every piece of evidence you need to prove his heroism is in here." The file contained photographs, surveillance reports, and Robert's own detailed notes about the trafficking network. He hadn't been killed trying to save random bear cubs. He'd been assassinated for getting too close to exposing the entire operation. His death had been both murder and martyrdom, a sacrifice that had ultimately made Morrison's downfall possible. Bailey himself seemed to understand that his ordeal was over. The remarkable bear cub stayed close to Eleanor and Ethan, but his behavior had shifted from protective alertness to simple contentment. He played with the toys the veterinarians had provided, ate the fish they offered, and dozed peacefully in Eleanor's lap. "What happens to him now?" Ethan asked as the sun began to set over the quarry. Agent Russo smiled, the first time any of them had seen her expression soften. "That's up to you. Bailey has been declared a material witness in a federal case which grants him special protective status. The courts can authorize his placement with qualified caregivers who can ensure his safety and well-being." Eleanor looked up at her son, a truth that still felt surreal after decades of careful distance. "I know a place where he'd be safe, where he could live semi-wild but still have family nearby. If you think he'd like that." Bailey made a soft chuffing sound and pressed closer to Eleanor, as if he understood every word. After 18 months of being tracked and hunted and valued only for his potential death, he had finally found what every living creature needed most: a family willing to fight for his right to simply exist. The nightmare was ending, but something beautiful was just beginning. 6 months after James Morrison's arrest, the morning mist still clung to Tellico Lake as Ethan finished his patrol route, but everything else about his life had transformed beyond recognition. The cabin that had once felt like a monument to loneliness now buzzed with the comfortable chaos of an unexpected family. Eleanor had moved into the guest room she'd helped Robert build 30 years ago, and Bailey had claimed the screened-in porch as his favorite sleeping spot, though he often migrated to Eleanor's room on stormy nights. The legal proceedings had concluded faster than anyone expected. Morrison's trafficking network had collapsed like a house of cards once the FBI began following the money trails Bailey's GPS chip had inadvertently documented. 47 people across 4 countries had been arrested, including 3 government officials who had provided protection for the illegal operations. Morrison himself was serving 25 years in federal prison, though he continued to insist his actions had been justified by circumstances that the FBI had proven were entirely fictional. Bailey had grown significantly over the past months, but his personality remained remarkably gentle despite reaching an age when most black bears became increasingly aggressive. Dr. Sarah Chen, now working directly with the FBI's Wildlife Trafficking Task Force, visited weekly to monitor his development and document his unusual behavioral patterns for her research on human-animal bonding. "He's not just socialized," Sarah explained during one of her visits, watching Bailey carefully share his breakfast fish with a family of raccoons that had learned to visit the porch each morning. "He's actually learned to mediate conflicts between other animals. I've never seen anything like it in wild bear populations." The morning routine had become sacred in their household. Eleanor would rise first, always the teacher accustomed to early schedules, and start coffee while Bailey stretched and yawned on his outdoor bed. Ethan would join them as the sun crested the mountains, and they'd sit together on the porch steps, watching the lake come alive with the day's first wildlife. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Eleanor said on this particular morning, her silver hair catching the golden light. She was wearing one of Robert's old flannel shirts over her jeans, and the years seemed to have lifted from her shoulders since the truth had come out. "Robert always said this place needed children's laughter. I think he'd be amazed to know he was right, just not in the way any of us expected." Bailey had indeed brought a kind of joy to the mountain that attracted other forms of life. Word had spread through the wildlife community about the bear who lived peacefully with humans, and the property had become an unofficial sanctuary for injured or orphaned animals. Eleanor had obtained proper permits to operate a small rehabilitation facility, using insurance money from the destruction of Sarah's center and donations from people who had followed their story in the national media. "Speaking of children," Ethan said carefully, producing an envelope from his jacket pocket, "this came yesterday." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened the letter. It was from a young woman named Emma Cartwright, the real granddaughter of a real Dr. James Cartwright who had died 5 years ago. Morrison had stolen not just the man's identity, but had been using his family's photographs to create his elaborate fiction. Emma had seen news coverage of the case and wanted to meet the people who had exposed the man who had been exploiting her grandfather's memory. "She's driving down from Virginia next week," Ethan continued. "She wants to thank us personally, and she's bringing her 8-year-old daughter, a little girl who, according to her letter, is absolutely fascinated by bears and has been following Bailey's story since the beginning." Eleanor wiped away tears she didn't bother to hide anymore. 6 months ago, the prospect of strangers visiting would have terrified her. Now the idea of sharing Bailey's story with a child who needed hope felt like the most natural thing in the world. Bailey seemed to sense the emotional significance of the moment. He padded over to Eleanor and gently placed his massive head in her lap, a gesture that never failed to amaze visitors who expected wild bears to be dangerous and unpredictable. His intelligence had continued to develop in remarkable ways. He could open doors, had learned to ring a bell when he wanted attention, and had even figured out how to turn on the outdoor water spigot when his drinking bowl ran dry. "The reporter from National Geographic wants to do a follow-up story," Sarah announced, arriving for her weekly visit with a bag of fresh salmon and her usual array of monitoring equipment. "Bailey's case has sparked a whole new field of research into inherited trauma and recovery in wild animals. Universities are offering grants to study his behavioral patterns." Eleanor looked skeptical. "I hope they understand he's not a research subject anymore. He's family." "They do," Sarah assured her. "In fact, the proposed studies would all be observational and non-invasive. Bailey would continue living here exactly as he does now, with researchers simply documenting his interactions and development over time. The data could help save other animals who've been traumatized by trafficking operations." The conversation was interrupted by Bailey's excited vocalizations from the yard. He was standing at the property's edge, looking toward the road with obvious anticipation. Moments later, they heard the familiar rumble of Agent Russo's government vehicle coming up the mountain road. Patricia Russo had become an unexpected friend over the past months, stopping by whenever her cases brought her through East Tennessee. Today she was carrying a thick folder and wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. "Morrison's final appeals have been rejected," she announced without preamble. 25 years, no possibility of parole. The judge said it was one of the most extensive wildlife trafficking operations in FBI history. Eleanor felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying finally lift from her shoulders. "And the others?" "Prison sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. And we've also seized over $12 million in assets that will be distributed to legitimate wildlife conservation organizations. Your brother's work literally saved hundreds of animals, Eleanor. Thousands if you count the future trafficking that's been prevented." Bailey wandered over to investigate the newcomer, though he'd met Agent Russo many times before. She'd learned to bring him small gifts, usually interesting sticks or smooth stones from her travels, and he'd developed an obvious fondness for her official FBI windbreaker, which he'd claimed as a favorite napping blanket. "There's something else," Russo continued, pulling documents from her folder. "The Department of Interior wants to establish a memorial wildlife sanctuary in Robert's honor. They're offering funding to expand your rehabilitation operation here into a full-scale facility that could serve the entire southeastern region." Ethan felt his breath catch. The scope of what they were offering was enormous, a chance to turn their small family sanctuary into something that could make a real difference for wildlife protection across multiple states. The memorial would include an educational center, Russo explained, with Bailey as the primary ambassador for anti-trafficking efforts. Visitors could learn about wildlife protection while seeing firsthand how animals recover from trauma when given proper care and respect. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the lake where Robert had taught both her and Ethan to fish, where he'd shared his dreams of a world where humans and wildlife could coexist peacefully. "What would Robert think?" she asked softly. "I think he'd be amazed," Ethan replied, remembering his father's passionate speeches about conservation. "He always said the most important thing was making sure no animal died for human greed. This sanctuary could prevent exactly that." Bailey seemed to understand the significance of the conversation. He moved to stand between Eleanor and Ethan, resting his head against each of them in turn, a gesture that had become his signature expression of contentment and belonging. "So what do you say?" Agent Russo asked. "Ready to turn this little family into something bigger?" Eleanor looked at her son. The word still felt miraculous every time she thought it. And then at Bailey, whose presence had brought them all together in ways none of them could have imagined. The bear cub who had nearly drowned in Tellico Lake had become the catalyst for healing wounds that had festered for 15 years. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice strong and certain. "But with one condition. This remains Bailey's home first and foremost. Whatever we build here, he has to be comfortable and happy. The moment this becomes more about the sanctuary than about his well-being, we scale back." Russo nodded approvingly. "The department specifically insisted on that provision. Bailey's welfare is written into the funding requirements." As the sun climbed higher over the mountains, painting the lake in shades of gold and emerald, the unlikely family of woman, man, and bear sat together on their porch, planning a future that honored the past while embracing possibilities none of them had dared to imagine. Robert Mitchell's legacy would live on, not in grief and loss, but in the daily miracle of love transcending every boundary, between species, between generations, and between the broken hearts that had somehow learned to heal together. The nightmare was truly over. The dream was just beginning. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as our worst nightmares. When Ethan pulled that drowning bear cub from Tellico Lake, he thought he was simply saving an animal's life. He had no idea he was about to discover the mother he'd believed was dead, expose a criminal network that had murdered his father, and find the family he'd been searching for his entire adult life. Eleanor had spent 32 years believing her son was gone forever, living with the kind of bone-deep loneliness that so many of us know too well. She'd resigned herself to growing old alone, feeding stray animals and baking honey cakes for neighbors, never daring to hope that purpose and joy could still find her at 67. But Bailey changed everything. That little bear became the bridge that brought a scattered family back together, proving that it's never too late for second chances, that love doesn't have an expiration date, and that sometimes the very thing that threatens to destroy us is actually leading us home. Eleanor discovered that being needed, being loved, and having someone to protect can happen at any stage of life, and it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. What moment in your life seemed like a disaster but later became a blessing? Have you ever felt it was too late for new beginnings, only to discover you were wrong? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.